Hello and welcome to P. Finney's Farts and Crafts. In this video, I'm going to be showing you how I made this latex monster mask. So I started off with a rough sketch of something that I wanted. If you know me, you know I like to make characters with giant noses, so of course that's what I did. And loosely going off of the sketch, I took some water-based clay and I started sculpting on a stone cast of someone's face, just so I knew that it would be the right size to fit over a face as a mask. Started off blocking off the rough shapes of everything, added the ears, and because his nose is so big and his eyeballs are so high up on his head, ended up having to line up the nostrils of the sculpt with where the eyes were on that stone cast. So once the mask was made, we could have little holes in the nostrils, so you're actually looking out of his nose when you're wearing the mask instead of his eyes. It's not a whole lot of visibility, you can just kind of see your feet. So this is a non-running mask. No stunts are going to be done in this mask. Something that I wish I hadn't really done in the sculpt is these ears. They're really thin, which ended up causing a few problems later on. I got to use these little eyeballs for the sculpture, which we would eventually take out of the clay and put back into the final mask. One of the last things I did with the sculpt was make some skin textures. So if you can see this, it kind of has that little bit of stippling and cross-hatching of skin texture. I took some wires and cross-hatched on the clay after it had dried a bit, and then took a wet paintbrush and ran that over the cross-hatching to kind of smooth it out a little bit, and that kind of ended up making a pretty good skin texture that I'm really happy with. So to start off the process of making a mold for this, I actually had to add a little more clay on the bottom of the sculpt, kind of to make a dam to catch the materials of the mold. So after the clay dam was built, I sprayed down the sculpture with a couple of sprays to make sure that the clay didn't stick to the material of the mold, because we're going to have to dig the clay out after the mold is dried. And I made the material of the mold, it's kind of like a stone powder that you mix with water. And for each pass of this mold, you mix the stone powder with a different amount of water. So layer 1 of this mold material has the most water, and that makes it a lot runnier, so it'll do a better job of seeping into all of your little fine grooves and textures in your sculpt. And that's how it was able to pick up the really fine skin textures. The next layer had a little bit less water, just so it was thicker, just to kind of give a little more initial thickness to this mold. The third layer was about the same as the second layer in consistency, and it actually dipped strips of burlap into the material and then laid the burlap over the mold. And this is to give the mold some more structural integrity, just so if it does crack, it's not going to fall apart, because the fibers of the burlap will be holding it together. And then for the last layer, it's just to add that last bit of thickness and smoothness to the mold. So it was a pretty thick concoction. As that was starting to dry, I just ran my hands over it to make sure it was nice and smooth, because once this stuff hardens, it's as hard as a rock and it can kind of cut your hands pretty easily. It gets really warm as it starts to dry, which I was not expecting. After the mold was completely dry, I flipped it over and dug all of the clay out. And this took a little longer than I was hoping because of these ears. They're so thin, it was really hard to get into the negative of the ear to pull all of the clay out. And once all the clay was cleaned out, we were left with this negative of our sculpture. Now that my mold was complete, I could finally lay down some latex inside of it. So for this, I took some liquid latex on a paintbrush and I stippled in layers of latex on the inside of the mask. For places like the ear where it's thin and I couldn't fit the brush in there, I just kind of poured a little bit of latex directly into the mold. And I think I did 6 layers of latex for this. So I'd stipple in a whole layer and let it dry a little bit and get tacky before I started the next layer. I did that 6 times, I believe. I think I should have done more layers of latex, because after the latex dries, you peel it all out of the mold, hit it with some baby powder so it doesn't stick to itself, and I found that it was very floppy. So to remedy this, I ended up taking some strips of foam and some adhesive spray and kind of laid down a little bit of a skeleton inside the mask, just so it keeps its form a little bit better when nobody's wearing it. And this helped a lot with the floppiness. So if I was to do this again, I would probably do like at least 10 layers of latex. And once the latex was pulled out of the mold, I was able to cut out the eye holes and the nose holes, as well as trim off any just excess latex. I was pretty concerned with little bubbles and imperfections, but as I was painting it, the little imperfections actually, I think, make it better, makes it a little bit grosser. There's a few bubbles that I ended up painting brown to make them like little moles and freckles. Which brings me to my next step. The next step was painting the mask. I started off with a base coat of kind of a fleshy red tone to cover the whole thing, and I pressed pretty hard with the paintbrush just to make sure it got into all of the wrinkles and stuff. And the next layer on top of that was some acrylic skin tone paint mixed with a little bit of water and a little bit of that liquid latex. And you mix it with a little bit of latex so that it binds to the actual material of the mask. And with this skin tone layer, I kind of used a bit of a dry brushing technique with a light hand to make sure that while I brushed it over the main surfaces, it didn't dip down into those creases, because I wanted those creases to keep that darker red base tone. And after the base skin tone was dry, I took some makeup brushes and some alcohol-based paint and just kind of ran that through the wrinkles to make them a little bit darker, and took some maroonish red tones around the eyes and around the lips and inside the ears and the nostrils a bit. And after the paint job, I took a little bit of like clear resiny material, I think, just some stuff that dried clear and shiny, and I put that on his lips and around his eyes and in his nose a bit, just to give it a little bit of shiny sheen to it. And after the paint job, I glued his eyes back into his sockets. The very last thing I did was add these little straps onto the back so that you can wear it hands-free. I thought I could get away with using some fabric glue to glue the straps to the foam bits, which it turned out that was not the move. It did not want to stick at all, and actually ended up hand sewing the straps to the foam, which so far is holding pretty well. And after I put the straps in, the mask was finally complete, and I decided to put it on for a little modeling session. I still needed to trim my beard, so I had this really nasty neck beard sticking out of the bottom of the mask, which just makes it even grosser. I hope you enjoyed this video. It was a lot of fun making this guy. I definitely want to do this again in the future, and if I do, I'll definitely take some like time-lapse videos and stuff of the sculpting process. And now I have this creepy mask in my house, and I don't know what to do with it, but it was fun to make. So if you enjoyed this video, please subscribe and leave a comment saying whether or not you would trust this man babysitting your kids. I'll see you in the next video.